getting inducted into the Hall of Fame doesn't get any better. And I'll be honest with you, I've been real excited about this. The fact that it's come to pass here in the 25th year, the anniversary of the UFC, puts the frosting on that cake. Because literally today, 25 years ago, I was on the phone with Campbell McLaren at SEG, Semaphore Entertainment Group, and we were talking about a potential TV deal. The next day I got a fax. There was no internet in those days. Al Gore hadn't invented it. But there was a fax from Campbell in which he said, we're already excited about this thing. We're going to send you a ticket. We want you to come to New York. So literally, we are literally in not only the year, but the day and the month when this all happened.
You know, I think a lot of people know the story now of how the concept came to pass and how it got developed, but I think people forget maybe how difficult it was to actually get this thing greenlit and to get it moving forward. So can you kind of recall, you know, once the concept was developed, how tough it was to actually get somebody to say, yes, we'll do this?
Well, you know, that's a really good question. This was a process. Early on, I had the idea for something I called, the working title was The World's Best Fighter. And that became War of the Worlds for a while. But it took a while to get Rorion Gracie on board. He wanted to do the Gracie Challenge, and everybody and his cousin had talked to him about that. But I did his advertising for free, and that really won him over. So I was able to get over that hump. Then we went out and got 28 investors to give us the capital to be able to sit at the table with the big boys, as I used to call them. So that was another hump. We had to convince 28 people to open their checkbooks. Then we had to find a TV partner, and that's where the real opposition came. Everybody pretty much said the same thing to me. What else you got? I said, this is it. And they all said to me, look, if you want to go to pay-per-view, that's the home of big boxing and big wrestling. But remember, that was my original epiphany, that I would figure a way to monetize the martial arts. Because when you think about it, if you was any good in the martial arts back in the day, you got out of the martial arts, you went into TV or the movies. Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, Steven Seagal, Jean-Claude Van Damme, they all did that. I had the idea that we could make the martial arts a place where athletes could make money. Probably my greatest pleasure today is running into a wrestler who says to me, if it wasn't for you, I'd be coaching at some college out in some town just outside of Bogalusa. But you know what really inspired me? It wasn't the kumites in Asia, which everybody talked about, which nobody had actually really seen. It was pankration. My homework told me that for over 1,000 years, the early version of the UFC was the biggest thing in the ancient Greek Olympics. So when people were saying no to me and slamming the door in my face, I was convinced that I was onto something. I was bringing back something that had been great in history.
So 25 years ago, you get the call and we're go. There's still a lot to do between now and November, right? So give me an idea of how the work began and where you progressed from here to November of 1993.
Well, you know, right after we got the green light with Semaphore, now the real hard work had to start, because actually one of the biggest sales that I had to make, I had to get 10 fighters to say yes to coming to the octagon in November of that year. Now, I came up with most of the fighters. Rorion came up with his brother Royce, and he introduced me through Frank Trejo, a Kempo guy in LA, to Zane Fraser, their IKF super heavyweight champ. But I had to get all the rest of the fighters. So I got ads running in the magazines, I got phone calls going, I got faxes going out all over the world to every association you can imagine, from Bangkok to Oslo, Norway. And everybody's saying the same thing to me. Is this a movie? Are you casting in a movie? Because my guy looks really good in front of a camera. I said, no, this is a real fight. So the battle was on to find all the 8 fighters for the tournament and 2 alternates. And I had 2 goofy ideas that I was stuck on. Number 1, I wanted a heavyweight boxer, and I wanted a sumo wrestler. And you have no idea what my difficulties were when I got on the phone with Japan, with a little pigeon Japanese that I got, and I'm trying to get a sumo wrestler. And they're telling me, sumo, a national honor sport of Japan, what you want is dirty fighting. It blew me right off the phone. It was even worse when I tried to get a heavyweight boxer. I spent weeks getting Emmanuel Stewart on the phone at the Kronk Gym in Detroit. And when he finally got on the phone with me, he said, you want to get a heavyweight pro fighter to get into a ring or some sort of a situation with a guy in karate pajamas? He said, whatever you're smoking or drinking, how come you ain't sharing? Now the big difficulty became getting the on-air talent and getting the octagon done. So as we moved towards November, Rorion and I had written a memo in which we outlined everything we wanted in this fighting arena. Bob Myrowitz at Semaphore said, how come we ain't just gonna rent a boxing ring? That's cheap. I said, because we're gonna do something that when people look at it, you could turn the sound off and you'll know that you're not watching a boxing match. So we wrote this memo, and we decided, I was big on having a 30-foot, almost like wushu platforms in China. I wanted a 2-inch pad underneath the canvas, because we had grapplers, and I figured there's going to be guys throwing the strikers down on their head or neck in a suplex. And Rorion was adamant that he didn't want a boxing ring. He said down in Vale Tudo in Brazil, in Rio, he said if guys would hit the mat, they'd roll out into the rope. He said it stops the fight, the referee, it's a problem. So all summer long, we're thinking about some sort of a situation that we can fight in. And Semaphore came up with 2 set designers from Hollywood, Greg Harrison and Jason Cussin. And these 2 guys were geniuses. And given the memo that we had written, they sat down and came up with 4 or 5 different, including one that had fake boulders and barbed wire on the top and torches. I had a temporary brief bout of insanity where I was thinking about something with a moat, something with an electrified copper pad on the perimeter. All summer long, it was a great debate. And the beauty of what we were doing was nobody had ever done it. So any idea was good until we could prove it, good or bad. But as we got working forward, we finally got all the fighters. The octagon got built. We lined up some talent. Semaphore did a good job of bringing in Jim Brown, Pro Football Hall of Famer, as the colored man on the broadcast.
Bill, I've been around the toughest fighters in the world, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Mike Tyson. I've been around the greatest NFL players, the tough guys, Dick Butkus, Sam Huff, all of those guys. But I'll tell you, they could not last in this ring.
Would you do it?
Would I do it? You mean
Yes.
when I was in my prime?
No.
You doggone right I wouldn't do it.
Oh, come on.
But we finally got close by November, and I think we were originally trying to do this on Halloween. And we had some pay-per-view conflicts, and eventually was scheduled for November 12th, 1993. I think Semaphore thought we might only get 30, 40,000 buys. We did almost 89,000 buys for the first show.
November 12th comes, you've jumped all the hurdles, you've gotten to that moment, but there's that famous line, ladies and gentlemen, tonight you're gonna see something you've never seen before. I wonder, as the doors are open, the octagon that you've envisioned and constructed is sitting there, you haven't had a fight yet, but I know there's that buzz of a live event, but you don't really know how it's gonna play out. Do you remember what your emotions were like that moment, what was going through your head?
November 12th, right before the show, I don't know if I ever had a moment where I had more emotions, more endorphins, more adrenaline pumping through me than that moment. I was so excited thinking about what we were doing. I had run into Rorion down in the bowels of the arena. We both dressed up in our new tuxedos, which we had bought together. And we looked at each other, and for all of the emotions that existed between us, we pretty much always agreed on a lot of things, but occasionally we butted heads. In that moment, we were brothers of another mother. We embraced each other, and it was one of those moments where I can still remember it. We both knew that we had gotten to the top of the mountain. Somehow we've been able to pull this thing off. Amazing.
It was a heck of an adventure getting to that point. It was a huge success financially right away, and obviously it's been a cultural phenomenon for 25 years. Knowing your passion and knowing your vision for it, how hard was it for you to walk away from the UFC?
Well, when I walked away really in 1998, I was really at that point, I'll tell fans this, that I was AWOL. I had gone AWOL at this point. I felt I had accomplished what I needed to accomplish. We had been under tremendous pressure from the media and from the politicians. I mean, Senator McCain was calling it human cockfighting. The New York Times said it's the most barbaric show in history. And we were watching an awful lot of the achievements that we had made be pushed back. We were losing pay-per-view by 1997. I remember when Bob Meyerowitz and I and John McCarthy flew to Denver to meet with Leo Hendry, the head of Viewers' Choice. And he had already made up his mind. We spent a whole day there showing him the new rules. John and I had been changing the rules since UFC 2. By the time of UFC 15, 85% of the rules that were adopted by the unified rules of MMA and were absorbed by the state of New Jersey in 2001 were rules that John and I had come up with. So we were watching this thing be somehow taken away from us. To some extent, I had already left emotionally. So in a way, I felt by selling to Semaphore in May of 1995, by finally leaving the UFC in January of 1998, in a sense, that was a door which I had already seen opening and which I needed to probably move through. It was time for me to move on. And I remember driving one time down Sunset Boulevard. This was many years later, and I looked up at La Brea, and there was this beautiful billboard, and Randy Couture was on it, probably with Chuck Liddell. And I remember thinking to myself, I remember recruiting Randy for the UFC, and I thought to myself, I'm almost like a divorced father. Somebody else is raising his kid, but they're doing all right. And who's raising him is doing a good job. Kazufa was doing a good job at that point.
So then it comes back to this. I mean, years later, now you're back in the fold. You're a UFC Hall of Famer. I mean, does this feel like kind of a full circle moment? Does it feel like maybe some appreciation or some validation for what you did to make this sport happen?
Absolutely. In fact, the greatest feeling that I have now, and what's really going through me, is it's like the UFC is in effect saying to me, you know, we know what you did, and you're part of the family, and we're glad you're here. It doesn't get any better than that.